Hope everybody's having a great Friday. Can everybody see what we're seeing here in terms of ZenHub?
Looks good,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Very good. Excellent. All right, so welcome to our regular Friday grooming. So as promised, today we're going to be covering authentication for the vending storefront. I have taken the liberties of starting to pre-groom some of the things we'll talk about, and so specifically we're going to be looking for enablers that create that account experience that you typically have seen in Magento 2, but then start to enable us on some things, both on the store, but also the integration part for things like retrieving orders and other aspects that in time will be great stories for us to groom, but also to tackle. So here's the current state of the backlog. Just a quick housekeeping note. We have added a new label for things that are going to be groomed on Fridays, and so anybody wants a sneak peek at what we're about to groom, we have added a grooming label here. So just a quick demonstration for grooming. Voila! So that's what we're going to be talking about today in the midst of our closing of Sprint 23 today, and then the beginning of Sprint 24 on Monday with a highly anticipated demo of Upward amongst many things. And so for today, we're going to talk about, again, authentication, and just as a reference point, going through kind of the old and new. Our goal is to take into consideration this experience right here, which you typically would get to from a header type of experience, but also at the end of completing an order. And I think from an experience standpoint, I think we may have some work some opportunities to find a better way to do that versus having to have created an account to pull that order down the road. There's probably a reasonable way to do that, but with PWA, maybe we can do some things differently there. But ultimately, we just need to, and from an MVP standpoint, use an existing account. Veronica Costello is the one that ships with the sample data, and that enables that. And then future stories would be, of course, the creation of such, the edits and validations, the password strength meter, and all kinds of things that you would see, including things like forgetting your password as well. And so again, these are key enablers, but we're going to start very small, kind of break these down to the smallest stories possible that we can either work with the community to assign, but also assign to ourselves, but then also identify, again, part of this exercise, identify things that may need some attention or help along the way. So this is kind of the before, and then Samia keeps us honest on kind of the after, and so we talked a little bit about this last week. Again, just as a refresher for folks, what we are going to do is take a bit of a look at the beginnings of this screen, but one of the stories for Samia that we're going to be creating is to create a much more simplified version of this that doesn't necessarily include things like Google or Facebook integration. Those are clearly great ideas, but they're more further down the road. You've got to get the account first done, and you've got to be able to retrieve something that exists done first. So we'll be doing that a little bit in parallel. So pardon the dust there, but again, for those who are following along with both the prototype and then kind of what we're doing in the previous world with Luma, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So any questions before we get started?
We're just going with the straight shot of you just fill out a form and create an account, right? That isn't linked to anything.
Even easier than that for the very first. So.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, that's.
There you go. Here. So that's a fantastic segue to essentially the beginnings of everything here, which is a basic login. The idea here, again, is not necessarily even to, again, we've made some annotations to show that we're not using Google and Facebook. And here in story number 249, we just want to be able to use something that exists. Again, sample data comes with an existing username and password. That alone would be a big win. And of course, this is our friend Ronnie Costello, but be able to pull that in and then be able to see the orders that she has created in the process. So that alone is going to, I mean, a much more bite-sized piece than creating an account and everything that's in here and there. We do have an account creation one that we'll review shortly after that will be very relevant. So.
And although I really love your mock-up, I will send you an updated screen.
Excellent. That's a good housekeeping note. I told Samia yesterday in private that for the items in UX that are in development, I will do my darndest to put a burst or other image to that will encourage the quick replacement of such in a much more delightful manner for that. And so look for more of these gems in future grooming. So, but Samia will have a story for herself starting next sprint to take a look at a much more simplified version that is a little bit closer to the mechanics of this than what you would see in this. So let's walk through the story itself. None of this should surprise you. And again, definitely want to get your guys' feedback. First of all, in terms of completion, but at the end, we'll seek the wisdom of the crowd for estimates themselves. And so in its most basic form as a shopper, we want to log into the Venya storefront using email and password, something that's previously created, so that he or she can access previous orders, subscriptions, and other features that are typically associated with an account. At the very least, of course, you just need an email and password. In an MVP stage, we're not even thinking about edits and validations yet. Certainly, we'd love to have those. Certainly, the API will pull back some interesting messaging here and there on the situations where that may not be correct and what that might be. And but at the very least, the MVP version of it doesn't worry about any of that yet. Maybe we can do something basic like OK or something of that nature. We'll build this, we'll evolve this, we'll make that messaging a little bit more interesting beyond that. But it's just most important for us to get this thing working using the live user information, the live password, so that we can enable other parts of the theme. So in terms of assumptions, again, we're using an existing account, our friend Veronica Costello, which you'll see shirts from Yissi and others asking, who is Veronica Costello? Just a quick side note. Yes. Basic error messaging, which we just talked about. Forget password, which is a future consideration and separate story. The creation of an account, also a separate story that we'll cover later today. And again, the basics of edits and validations. If you've left a field open, if you have a mistaken password, all the things that would start off in the basics of where we left off with Luma. But from a UX standpoint, we've got nothing but the highest expectations from Samya to make those experiences great, as well as some of the great forms work from Jimmy, and that I think can be applied to this situation as well. So the assumptions, the tasks themselves, again, once those assumptions are clear, some discovery work, again, similar to what we did with Jonathan and Paul on kind of learning how this might work with the API. How might this work? How can you pull this information? All types of considerations, of course, around security and clear text and things on password. Let's understand that. So that'll be a task. The next will be, of course, displaying any relevant error messaging. We might get that for free, so let's see what that looks like. And of course, implementing it, which we can add there. That's probably pretty obvious. But then, of course, testing and documentation, looking for any items that we would then kick off and get some help with from James here in the room on the side. So that's it. Again, hopefully not too much of the obvious, but I wanted to get you guys' feedback on this one. Any questions, comments on the story itself, the assumptions, the tasks? I'm adding one task just to keep it, so the implementation piece of that. So, okay, well, very good. So as I type this up, so be thinking about what an estimate looks like for this. Again, this. So give yourselves just a few minutes here. We will a few seconds really, and then we'll pull together the average of the estimates across the room. So be thinking about how big this would be using our traditional estimation, Fibonacci style, starting off with that. So give me just a minute to finish this up, and we'll do estimates next. All right, update this here. Perfect. Excellent. All right, so let's talk about estimates. So who would like to who'd like to start us off with an estimate? Who wants the first bid on this one in terms of the beginnings of its implementation?
I'm sure we can do that.
No? All right. All right, we pull this up as a reminder. Don't leave it to the product manager. I'll make all these one, and we'll have a busy spread.
Well, we just joined. We're the Bar Green folks.
Hey.
Hey.
Hello.
Happy to be here.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Oh, yeah, this is Connor. Another friend.
Hey, Connor, how are you?
I'm doing well.
How are you doing?
So we're just kind of, we just joined, so we don't maybe have the full scope of it, but it looks like maybe a 5 to us.
Yeah.
Yep. And do you feel like that? So now, having gone through this, the kind of last week compared to this week, do you feel like you feel better about those types of estimates? This one's just the beginnings of essentially a form that pulls email and passwords from the live data. So the style and the approach is probably not dissimilar from what you were doing around shipping and payment methods, and the basics of which would not include any niceties around edits, validations, and things like that. So we're keeping it super simple. So do you feel pretty good about that?
I might move that down to a 3 then if we're using a similar style and not worry too much about validation.
Yeah, no, I would definitely do that. 3 is probably reasonable. That's like half a week, right? Or is that?
Half a week. So basically, a point is basically a day. We do account for, we do account a little bit for overhead in our larger estimates, and we try very hard not to have 13s, which are just, often very big spikes along the way. But yeah, about half a week as a 3 there.
Yeah, so that sounds good to me.
Yeah, that does.
Cool. Excellent. Anybody want to second that 3 or raise it a 5 or lower it to a 1?
I'll call it a 3. 3 seems good. I'm getting more.
Feels good to me relative to what we had last week, if for what that's worth. And of course, we find it to be bigger than that. We are kind of learning this together. We're getting better at the estimations every week, and as we identify some dependencies, we can we'll kick those off as separate stories. So cool, excellent. A 3 it is.
Could I just ask a few qualifying questions around this?
Yes, please.
So at the moment, is this assuming that all API calls that are needed are in place and you're not having to update anything?
Correct.
That's right.
And you're then piggybacking on the existing Magento session as well. So PWA Studio doesn't create its own auth session or anything like that?
I would believe so, unless I can think of a reason why that wouldn't.
Yeah, no, we're not going to introduce state where we wouldn't need to. Yeah, I mean, the REST APIs that manage login, they return cookies, and then you just include credentials from that point forward. It's entirely managed at an API level.
And then the last bit would just be the unsurprising request to make sure that the autocomplete attributes are in there appropriately. But I wouldn't imagine that affects the estimate very much.
Let's get those autocompletes in there, and also make sure that if they autocomplete in a way that is obscuring other controls, that it is easy to dismiss them, which is, I don't know.
Right. Can we request password masking on this one? Would that blow the estimate on the input type on that one? Can I ask for that? All right.
Yeah, that's part of the browser's implementation.
Just making sure. So good catch, Rowan. Then I'll also just for the sake of this, I know we've got a lot of familiar faces here, but very often people will check the recording or see afterwards. This REST-based approach for things that are either in development or further along, or aren't further along yet in GraphQL, is the approach we'll take for things, right? And so this authentication, I'm not sure what the ETA is for on that one, but we would be using REST until that's ready, and so that's the approach we'll take here in this hybrid approach on things. And so that's a good call out, and it's a good reminder that of these assumptions along the way. So. All right, perfect. All right, and so good additions there in terms of the assumptions. And so again, just kind of going back out to the team, do any of these assumptions change the estimate of 3 on this? Is still feeling okay about that, or do you feel like we need an extra day or so?
Seems good.
Seems good.
Perfect. Updated. Anything else on this one? Any other questions or comments on this one from a team's perspective? All right, this one is sorted. Thank you, everybody. So let's take a look at some of the related ones. These actually should be a little bit more straightforward. Let's start off with the simple one here first. And so this one is forgot password. Again, this is likely not as important as creating an account, but for the purposes of kind of building on the momentum that we just did in terms of the basic login, I thought this would be a good one to cover. So this one, of course, is blocked by the existence and the utilization of basic login for Venia. So we do sequentially afterwards. Makes sense. And then for those who are following along with the existing experience, this is what we've got today. Super basic. The curveball on this one is going to be CAPTCHA on this one. I can't make claim yet on terms of the progressive considerations for something like that, since it does go outside for that. So there may be some discovery work there. And in terms of the actual scenario-based approach, again, we'll throw this out here as a shopper. We want to be able to reset your account password of Venue in the event that you've forgotten it, and send it to my registered email address. So for this one, nothing too fancy in terms of sending to mobile or anything like that we've experienced, but something very, kind of the MVP style would be simply just an email, not worrying yet about whether or not that account exists or not. That alone is probably a security question or security concern in terms of people trying to find accounts that exist. So not worried about that, but then I think CAPTCHA is still, I think that's in play. That helps out a lot. And so I'd like to consider that unless we feel like that blows the estimate by a week. But I think there'll be some research there to see if that changes anything in terms of our kind of page weight and things of that nature. So simple on that one. So separate experience, email, CAPTCHA, and then send. And then the assumptions on that would be, of course, again, existing accounts. I think we can use Veronica for this one. And then again, basic error messaging. If anything comes back, and again, the account doesn't exist, I personally think that's a bit of a security opening. But let's see what comes back for that one, and then we'll proceed. Proceed as normal. We may make that static, saying if an email exists, we'll send it to you, and that seems to be pretty standard fare for that one. So the tasks themselves, and this one again, the big one's going to be discovery. I think there's going to be a little bit playing around with this, understanding the way that mail is hooked up into a Magento instance, because it fires that off. Some research and implementation on CAPTCHA. Hopefully that's straightforward. Maybe not. And of course, looking out for Mr. Kalkoben here, testing and documentation as appropriate. So that's what we've got. Again, in terms of the experience itself, we probably want to put a concept in here. We don't yet have it in the prototype, but it'd be pretty fairly similar to what we've got here in some fit or fashion, at least for MVP considerations. But that's what I've got. So any questions, comments, or concerns on this one?
Go back to the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we considering keeping them signed in to be automatic, or are we going to provide that sort of memory of keep me signed in unless I elect to sign out? Is that something we're discussing at this point?
Good question. That would probably be a separate story in terms of maintaining state from the previous one that we just did on actually authenticating itself. I know traditionally we haven't done that. I'm not saying but I don't know what that would entail.
Yeah, I'm just asking. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, if we're not doing it, that's fine. If we are considering it, then I would like to keep that in my book.
Yeah.
So I know what we're trying to extend to work.
I would say for the sake of at least our current velocity and MVP approach on this one, I like the idea. I think we should document it, but I think we would still be okay without it. But if we happen to find a burst of help that can help us tack that on to the story we just talked about, I think it's absolutely. So from a design standpoint, I think we basically would have a consideration should that come back in. So make sure we don't paint ourselves in the corner there. So should it come back? But in terms of what we would want for the initial release, I think we're okay without it for that. So
Cool. One more question.
Yep.
I know that Magento and Luma and all of this have this pattern of that required mark.
Yes.
However, on a authentication form which only has username, email, and then username or email and password, it seems redundant to say they are required, because how else would you sign in? Are we, in general, for form fields, are we comfortable going ahead with the convention that we have, which is we mark all required fields, or do we want to go with only marking optional fields and assuming that everything else is required?
I don't have enough context to understand why we would do the latter. I guess it sounds like just for space conservation purposes, right?
No, I mean, like in cases like this, it doesn't make sense to indicate that it's required because everyone knows it's required and you have to have both to sign in.
Yep.
And then having that thing that says required fields, to me, that's just, I don't know. It's a personal opinion.
So,
But if
having gone
sorry.
through a lot of recovery processes,
Yeah.
you know, for various things, I know that there are all sorts of ways that it can be done and that they could potentially be augmented. Like, do you have a recovery code? Do you have two-factor authentication? Enter your recovery code or a two-factor auth, or we'll text you. So I don't think that it's guarantees that all possible future variations on this form will have all fields be required.
Right.
So if we went to a thing where if all fields are required, it doesn't show required.
No, I mean, are we going with the convention that we mark required fields or we mark optional fields? Assume if out of 10 fields in a form, one is marked optional, it then means that everything else is required. Versus
Right.
9 required.
Go ahead.
And yeah, the only one that isn't marked is deemed optional.
So you could say all fields are required at the bottom and then have like a blue star and then all fields are required except fields marked, you know, optional.
We could.
I feel like it needs explanation.
Yeah. So how about this? I would say, so I think it's a larger consideration. I think that essentially that standard should be part of the global styles work.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm asking.
Which I think is probably where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I would say from a product standpoint, I would want to only note the exceptions. Now the exceptions could. So I'm riding the fence a little bit on this one, whether it's required or optional. But I personally think it's a lesser experience when we litter. We litter the either required or the optionals all over the place. And so I would defer to you guys on the final call on that one, but I would say let's just note the exceptions versus the what's here otherwise. So
yeah, I still have to have that extended discussion on form fields with Jimmy. So we'll add this talking point and we'll let you know. Where we
and there's probably good secondary research. I mean, what would Luke W do type of thing? Like, there's probably some good research that there are some good fundamentals that we could probably build from if we needed it. So.
Yeah, and at least in all the testing that I've been in the past year, it's elegant to mark the optional fields, but it's still not easily recognized by people.
Right.
They still look for those. I mean, if they don't see the required mark, they assume they don't have to fill it, and then when they try to proceed and it stops them, they're like, well, but it doesn't say it's required. So I'm kind of conflicted on this. I'll discuss with Jimmy and we'll see where we land.
Okay. Cool.
It's been on my mind, sorry, that's why I brought it up.
No worries. So I'll put the global styles note in the assumptions on this one. I think that's a good boilerplate for a lot of the work that we're doing here. So that references the safe standard in that. So I think we're covered there. But yeah, let's dig in a little bit more on that one. I think for the purpose of this story, fairly agnostic. I think we can both assume them to be required. The presentation itself, I think, will just be we'll be tentative until we come back around to that one. So I'm okay with that for the purposes of at least testing the reset capability and then fast following with what would be the better kind of global style across the board. So.
And we could do a quick A/B too. It's not that hard.
Excellent. Yeah. On that note, I think in terms of the UX, I have to believe there's an easier captcha that's out there. I've used this one several times before, and I feel like I'm squinting more than the average person, and so that I'm certainly open to suggestions in the implementation of ones that are a little bit more user friendly, but of course open source along the way. This may be the best we've got, but there may be an opportunity to revisit that, both from an experience standpoint, but also technically if there's something that's more friendly in our world for that. Because I can't tell you what those letters are right now.
I think it says VTWQ, but who knows?
I mean, captchas will get.
How about that one? Try. Tell me what that is.
AZFX.
Sure. All right.
AZFX.
All right. There we go. All right. Anyways,
Eric's a robot, and now this is uncomfortable.
That's true. That's true. All right. There it is. All right, so I think a good discussion on some of the boundaries here. Again, I think we've got a note on global styles. I think we have hopefully a push on CAPTCHA that makes that a little bit more interesting. Any other questions? Any other questions, comments, assumptions that we should think about for this initial experience? All right. right, but you guys know what question I'm going to ask next then.
Let's size it.
Let's size this thing.
Oh, yeah.
All right, who would like to get the ball rolling for this one as I add a few notes here? And don't let the product person do it. I'm going to call this a 1.
You are not going to call it a 1.
You guys, this is my strategy. I'm telling you, I'm putting burst images on designs. Anything needs to be done. I'm leading with a low expectation to push it higher.
I want to call this an 8. And the reason is that there's security concerns that we have to think through carefully. I don't immediately see what's going to take so long. But I can tell you that, first of all, displaying a CAPTCHA image and then refreshing that CAPTCHA image in a PWA context will have to be an API.
Yeah.
Because you can be damn sure that if you are refreshing a CAPTCHA image and it's supposed to come with no cache header, that your service worker does not use the old one, you have to be careful of this.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that it's done right. And I'm here to be consulted about it, but I want to be very conservative about estimation. And I think also that opens the floor. I mean, if anyone here thinks you can do it as a 5, then do it as a 5 and laugh in my face. I'll love it. But I think this is an 8.
So a few points on that. I mean, I would push possible to drop CAPTCHA from the MVP side unless this is a built-in part of the Magento process.
Okay. So you're also a robot.
Yes, yeah. Well, I also maintain the PHP client library for reCAPTCHA, so I have a vested interest. I feel like I should just declare that now.
Yeah.
And then the other bit that I'd follow up on this, does this story include the target pages from this? So if I've forgotten my password and I get the email and I follow that link, is that in this story? Is that a change or reset password story?
It's actually a great question. I would say, so I don't disagree on the CAPTCHA piece. I think that alone, if there is a bit of a discovery effort around that, we can break that out and kind of add that iteratively. And so for the sake of that one, I'd be okay. But again, being the pushy product person, I like to bring in the email piece of this because I think that's part of the testing and the demo. Even if it's a very basic, this should fire off an email that does this. I'm less worried about initially the presentation of that. I think we can probably leverage what's already done in M2. We'll come back around to that iteratively in a separate story. Yeah. Are you guys? Does that sound? It's a good call out that it's not there, but I'd like to add it for this one. But pull out. I'm okay with pulling out CAPTCHA per Rowan's suggestion. Is that reasonable? Did we just go to a 13? How's everybody feel about that?
Go to a 13.
Yeah.
No, the CAPTCHA brings it down. I mean, I would say it's a 5, but we still want to be conservative about something that has security implications.
Yeah, and actually, I think my question as well was that I assumed the email was already part of the Magento backend, and that would just stay as is. It was about the actual password reset link that I'm clicking when I return to the Venia theme, if that is this story or if it is a separate story, which is reset password.
That is an even better question. So I would, unless you guys can think of a better way to break this up, I would find it hard to test whether this or not without something basic there of actually creating that, other than this just kicking off the email. So but I do understand that makes things a little bit larger, but is there a way for us to include a very basic version of that?
Look, this is not a popular sentiment, but do you know what confers business value? A link that pops a dialogue that says, this isn't actually possible online and you need to call us. I know we all hate that because that's what happens when we try to cancel cable, but it does at least communicate that it is possible to recover your account information. So I would say that that's actually an implementation of this story that I would accept. And that's just to liberate you. Like, let's not do a research spike and like find out what's possible. Yeah. Let's just get an implementation going, and then if it turns out to be inadvisable to continue, then that's what I would like to live.
Okay.
Does that strike anyone as terrible?
Can you say that again?
It's just, I think that an acceptance criterion for the story should be that it is, as a user, I want to be able to recover my account information if I don't remember how to log into it. I think that an acceptable piece of that is to be given contact information to do that on the business side. And I'm not saying that that's what we should do. I'm saying that it is an acceptable fallback, and so we could scope the story, and then if the implementation of doing it online turns out to be hard or impossible, just pop the contact field, and we'll accept it with, slight disappointment. But I'm just saying it's story acceptance and contribution and movement.
Yeah. So let's walk through that. That's certainly more minimal. I think everybody will agree on that. The question is it viable, right? And so I think, are you envisioning a scenario where you would click reset your password and then immediately see this essentially simple content?
Dropped off. We were discussing whether or not acceptance criteria can include a fallback to a contact form. I mean, before we go any further discussing it locally, let's open the floor. Does anyone have thoughts on that as just as a solution to a story that can be later augmented if the API fails you? See, everyone agrees with me. That's what that silence means. Is that the first thing you do? The first thing that we would do is.
I was going to say I do agree with you on this one, because as well I think the forgotten password functionality, something I'm seeing more and more often, is not actually a reset password form, but just email me a one-time login link. So by separating out these stories, you enable that possibility as well. So this is very much the I forgot my password. You're covering off the validation of the email, the talking to the back end to trigger that email, and then the links in that subsequent email are a separate story.
We may do that. We may go for that.
I do like that. If that's again not a 13.
I love it. I mean, I think that implementing mail relay for testing purposes might be a toughie. So let's say this. Can we change the stories definition to implement account recovery for Venia? And then instead of as a shopper, I want to reset my account password. As a shopper, I want to be able to recover access to my account with the Venia store, even if I've forgotten my credentials. And then you could satisfy that with a link to a contact form at the absolute minimum, but then you could satisfy it with a reset password, with an email me a one-time password, and that frees up the implementer to get something done.
So basically, we're still asking for something that's more viable, but we're giving some options in case that can't be done. So we're almost saying it's the semantics of this.
We're stating the story in terms of the scenario and the business value instead of just trying to replicate a particular workflow that Magento happens to have today.
Okay. I'm okay with that. I do like the scenario that Rowan had talked about where we separate the actions from the email itself. I do like the creation of that as a nice outcome, but then separating what happens next. I don't know what the level of effort would be on like a magic link of some sort, but I think that would certainly be an improvement. Even separate from progressive that we might want to strive for. So that'd be good.
It logs you in and then asks you to set a new password.
Yeah.
And it's
Okay. All right, so keep me on this, folks. Let's see, recover my account information from Venia in the event that I have forgotten.
Be clear, I like it too. It's just out of scope.
No, this is grooming, right? So I think we're looking at this from many ways. So I'm fine with that. All right, assumptions already created. Tasks, discovery. Optional. We take CAPTCHA out. Implement basic act Vinya screen, and then for the details. So we're going to implement the screen, and then from the screen, and then review and let's see, how about discovery for mail. Setting password. And then I think also on the assumptions, just so we don't forget, future considerations for Magic Link and separate link to set password. All right. So we've got under the guise of account recovery, we're leaving some options open. We'll still assume they have an account created. Error messaging is maybe not necessarily be an assumption anymore because we may not need it. Future considerations. Assumptions actually would be, I'm going to assume involves sizable discovery. Result could range from screen to partial implementation. The grab bag of stories, but with kind of low, barrier to entry. Task themselves, discovery, implement the basic screen, discovery for mail events, possible sample email, and then testing and documentation. So I think the basics are probably there for you to go several of those different ways. What does everybody think? You feel like that's good? Does that capture this? Not capture it, but capture this. Any questions or considerations?
I would say the future considerations for Magic Link thing is fun, but I don't think it belongs in assumptions. I would say it is a potential future, and then we don't really have a section for that. To-dos, research spike, or something just to directly backlog right now. Again, because PWA Studio is about consuming services which might be able to do something like a mail relay, it's not in our scope. But if we want to strongly advocate for it, because Rowan is right that it's a best practice, then that may be our work to do, and then we would go and yell at GraphQL to do it. And I do mean yell. We would scream. And potentially also, if somebody on this call thinks that it's appropriate for us to add as part of a PWA module account recovery using a magic link, say so. But I think it's out of scope. I think it's not. That's not something that's particular to progressive web apps, though it is a best practice. It's just something that you ought to do.
Yeah. All right, so I'll add it to comments to keep us honest on that.
I would.
If it comes through, then fantastic. And if we have interest on on Slack and other channels, we can queue that up for the next item in a future grooming. So
sweet.
Okay, good. All right. Any other questions before the next question? All right, you guys know where I'm going to ask. Well, how big is this now? What kind of estimate are we looking for now in this new story?
I think it's a 5.
All right. Anyone like to second? Anybody would like to second that estimate?
I'm not supposed to be the one who says it first.
Well, again, if you leave it to me, I'll do this. I only can do this with one grooming. I'm not going to be able to do it.
No, I concur. It's also a 5, I think, Eric.
Yeah. It feels that way. I'd hate for it to be any more. Again, in the spirit of creating. About this kind of back and forth. So it's me, but again, I'm not the one building it.
This feels like grooming.
This does.
And it is.
All right. Excellent. Estimate has been seconded. We will we'll go forth with that estimate. I will add comments for what I am crossing my fingers is a magic link present later this year, but clearly not progressive. But I think we're good. So we've got 2 stories. This one I think is good. We thought this was going to come in very very specific, but I think we opened it up into what I think is a much more meaningful story around recovery. So. All right, so we've got 11 minutes left. Let's give this a shot. So this is create account. So create account is again once everything is done. Again, not this is something to consider. This is by default got to be larger. May need to be considered into smaller stories in this. But what I wanted to do is to begin thinking about what that looks like. Again, based on the previous experience, create an account. If you want to again look at where we come from. Which is right here. Super basic, first name, last name. Again, global styles considerations from Snapman on this one. There's quite a few required field, at least annotations on that one that they could be visually simplified. The sign up for newsletter, which I don't necessarily think is MVP, but it might be a kind of a nice to have if we can get that for free. And then again traditional password and confirmation. I think also for MVP, as much as I like the meter, that also is probably not necessarily MVP. We can look at that in the additional story. So that's what we've got. So access points on this one would be upon sign in and or at the, as we'll see here in the story, at the end of an order, which we may want to reevaluate. I think that was done. You'll see that in Luma as the ability to create an order to track your order at the confirmation, which is a little wonky. So there may be some UX work down the road to make that more of a point of need or essentially a guest checkout type of experience down the road. But again, not MVP. There's just a little bit of history there.
Well, and there's a few use cases around that too, like you don't have an account, already have an account when you prompt them to sign in if we're not remembering the signed in state.
Yep.
When do you want them to create that account? Is it the end of the checkout? Is it before they check out?
Right.
These are all
Well, this also gets into future consideration because again, we're thinking about enablement for viewing orders. Imagining a world where we can view an order without authentication, which is fairly typical, right? Which we think even further out around progressive, this idea where the order itself, and I think Rowan appreciates this, becomes almost a notification or something that would actually be added to a home screen. Wouldn't it be nice if that wasn't barred by authentication? So we've got to get the happy path done first, but as we get beyond all of that, imagining a world where orders aren't always bound to a login, but we'll get there. We need the basics first.
Orders aren't always bound to a login today in that.
Not easily.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit sort of. So are we going with the approach for the flow in general that create account will exist or will be displayed or will have a place to live until that account is created? Then that's just entirely replaced with sign in. And it would originate from the same place, like wherever you created the account from, where it lives, where that button was or that call to action was, that then becomes sign in.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, other questions can be asked much later.
No, those are good ones. So, and then also things like terminology. I know we've gotten some feedback from Brendan and others on how we call the beginnings of this. I think there's a whole content suite on this one as we look through this. But again, for the purposes of having some things that are up and running to work from to kind of prove this out, there's some flexibility here up front.
Okay.
Cool. So this is what we've got. So again, just think about the before experience and then how we'll eventually come around with UX for the after. So this one, as a shopper, I want to create an account with Venia so that I can access previous orders, subscriptions, and other features again, associated with the account. First name, last name, subscription. Again, if that comes for free, email, password, and confirm. I think to our previous story, there may be some considerations around security that we might want to break this out into different ways. I'm certainly open to that. And I think for things like password strength and others, those are going to be, and even edits and validations, making sure that you've got, the last name with the first and all of the things you'll see currently.
Can we, I
Those
I
may be down
work
the
with
road.
you offline, but I need those kind of defined so I can cover all of those
Yeah.
in the mocks, and I can work with maybe Laurie to kind of refine all that messaging.
Absolutely. You will have a UX story associated with this at the same time. So, and a lot of this should be the same, but we'll link it as a dependency. But
okay.
Yep, good call. So those are the assumptions. The tasks themselves, again, we want to be able to, again, discover, to store and verify the email and password. So just, again, almost similar to what we did around checkout, the ability to actually see this come through on the back end, that is the most minimum viable aspect of happening. Having it come back and display, actually even going to an account page itself, which you'll see is not even shown here. Those are future considerations. Those are great. We'll get there. We got to be able to create this thing first, because that is a test of the APIs and really how this works with the back end. So we've got that. I did add basic error messaging. We may get something interesting from the API. If we don't, that's okay. But and then also, of course, testing and documentation. So that's what I've got. Again, the focus here is just the creation experience, but I think there's enough to map from the existing to at least think about how this might work and maybe challenge some assumptions on security and other things that we've done previously. So, what does everybody think? Any questions, comments? Am I missing anything?
Does the existing API surface account for transferring like an anonymous basket to the newly created user?
Yes, it does. And it does so through the background session. It does a cart merge, if I'm not mistaken. And there are a couple of folks, I think, Alex and even Anton, who can correct me there. But that's been my experience, that it does a cart merge completely on the back end, and there's no specific method you need to invoke to do that. If you had an anonymous cart, I think there's some occasions where conflict might occur, like a discount code or something, and I think it's always just resolved as the anonymous cart wins because of the assumption that you set that up more recently, or it's done based on timestamp.
Yeah, I agree. Generally, I know there is a functionality, but I never work with it in practice. I cannot tell you like details there. It's have to be there.
And Rowan, I just added the rest considerations there as well, like we did with the previous story. It's a good footnote. This won't be coming via GraphQL anytime soon. Hopefully, but you can get started without it. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, at the risk of like outing myself, where do we start if we want to consider security considerations?
Okay, what is that outing? I'm sorry, are you outing yourself as someone who cares about security?
Well, not understanding it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's responsible to do. I think if you claimed to understand security, that would be worrisome. So if you're implementing a forgot password, form, I think you first of all have to make sure that you're not allowing XSS to access the sensitive information like username, and that if there's a password form field, that you've got it secured, that you have autocomplete turned off. You can kind of look this stuff up, like login form security best practices. There isn't really like some sort of cryptographic, like college boy thing about this. It's just like kind of cover the bases. If there's a cryptographic college boy thing about it that Rowan can think of, then totally toss it on me. I want to know. Should we? Yeah. There's a JavaScript library for TLS that works entirely in the browser. So.
Well, it did occur to me, and this is maybe just a note for any other form-related things. If you've got like repeat form submission protection built in at the moment. Because that should just be like appear on everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now our Magento REST API client does not debounce posts for the reason that they're not safe or idempotent, but you can instruct it to do so very easily. There's a single flag that you can call that says multicast this request whether or not you think it's safe to, and forgot password request might be the perfect thing to multicast, because it's really, there's no chance that you want two of those in flight at the same time.
And I think like, create account and sign in are both examples of that, but probably not for, I think you can get away without that for MVP.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the thing is, multicasting involves matching that the two requests are identical. And you don't have an arbitrary way to key off of them without just doing something naive like taking a checksum of the headers and the body. And if there's something that's time dependent, or if there's something that's random about it, then, you know, et cetera. But right now, I think the thing we can do is just use the flag to say debounce and multicast this request. And that's just multicast true when you run the fetch. Is that ringing a bell with anyone, by the way? Because I wrote this thing. It's sort of documented. James, is there, Mr. Kalkin, is there like that documentation of the API client? That's out on the PWA dev docs. Okay. If it's not, then
the Magento 2 one?
No,
sorry.
Not the REST APIs, though. That's nice to have, definitely. But I mean the REST API client that I wrote for use talking to REST APIs today.
Got it.
Though ultimately we'll replace it with, you know, a GraphQL transformation of the same. The client that I wrote should be in PWA Studio. You can go to the PWA Studio repository.
I can. We are at time, though. I don't want to make.
We are at time, yeah. So you know, you can go there. You
Yeah.
can search for Magento REST API, and the considerations that you have about making sure not to double up on form submission and making sure not to accidentally create multiple accounts, or, you know, accidentally do more work than is necessary. It's all there.
Cool.
Yep.
Cool. So let's do a couple things. So I think this one's close to being finished, but I'd like to tee this up at the beginning of next week just to make sure that we've got enough rigor and insights on that. And then I think you've done some really good work on the Upward proposal, which starts to touch a little bit of this.
Yeah.
So maybe we can set something up separate, but then kind of look for some updates on Slack and the in other channels as well to see if we can get some feedback there as well.
I think that the right thing to do is a webinar. We need to, so I've talked about it a bit. We need to schedule a webinar. Everybody here on this call will receive an invitation to it, of course. It'll happen separately from our sprint ceremonies so that it doesn't sort of crowd them out.
Perfect. Makes sense. All right. Well, good progress, guys. This is our grooming continue to get really, really strong. So I appreciate everybody's input, their participation. I know it's late, especially in Europe. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I continue to be humbled by all the input and all the energy for folks here. By all means, let us know if you have any questions. We'll send out the recordings here for those who were unable to join us. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day and afternoon, and we'll talk soon.
Hey.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.